Hi, all. Welcome for another Iowa Archaeology Month live stream program. Today, we're going to do sort of an informal Q&A, also known as Ask Me Anything with Veronica Mraz. So Veronica started at our office in 2019. So she arrived and was here several months before the pandemic started. But last year is a forgotten year, so she's still fairly new. So this is a good opportunity for you all to get to know Veronica a little bit better. And we can also focus today's questions, if you would like, on lithic analysis. So, Veronica, do you just want to give a really quick background of your expertise?
Sure. Well, I do lithic analysis, but I also do experimental archaeology. So I spend a bit of time trying to figure out how did the stone tools get that way that we, pull them out of the ground. So I do a lot with heat treatment. I do a lot with flint knapping, um, and just kind of have a lot of fun like that.
And so, to provide a little bit more background, I guess one, how did you get into archaeology? And then, once in archaeology, what made you veer towards studying lithics?
Well, I started in archaeology actually pretty early. I got into it in high school. I actually went on my first dig at 16 in Iowa, so up in Cherokee County at the Crocker site. And I got into it because I was starting to think about colleges and what I wanted to do. And I was really good at history classes, but I did not want to sit in, a library all day. And so I started looking what else could you do with history. And that is, as they say, is history. I got into archaeology, never looked back. It's just been an absolute blast. And I guess I got into lithics really because they have a great time depth series. They're the one artifact that doesn't really decay. And so I had a lot of early professors that, worked old world. And so they're dealing with, artifacts that are several millions years old. You're like, whoo. And then you come into the Great Plains, you're like, this is a lot cooler. It actually looks like a tool mostly rather than just, flakes and a hand axe. Not that those aren't cool, they are, but I like the variability from the Great Plains. So,
If you came to Iowa from studying in Oklahoma, correct?
sort of. I'm actually from Iowa. So, I did my undergraduate degree actually here at the University of Iowa. And then I went to the University of Tulsa to do my graduate work. And that was a bit of a trip. It was only supposed to be for 2 years. And well, 8 years later, I have 2 degrees now.
And I just want to remind people who are tuning in and watching that this is an Ask Me Anything question and answer. So you can type questions in the comment box at any time, and we'll just answer them as they come in. We're not going to wait till the end. And I have a few questions. I'll just keep asking Veronica until we see some more questions come in. Okay, so we know you're a lithic specialist. You also do experimental archaeology. Can you describe what that means?
So that basically is, if you have any question about how a tool ends up that way, you devise an experiment to try to come up with that. So, especially with heat treatment, there's a lot of questions of why did people heat treat? Why would you go through all of the steps and all the time to heat treat the stone? And so we've kind of, come up with a number of laboratory experiments, some actualistics, so hands-on, people actually flint knapping, and looking at some of that as well as looking into some of the ethnographic record and why ethnographically do we see that people were heat treating. Um,
And so we got a couple questions already, but there's one related to that
okay.
we'll talk about first. So John is asking, can you talk a little bit about how heat treatment changes flint knapping?
Absolutely. So, depending on, how in depth we want to go into this, because that's a topic I could talk about until I'm blue in the face. Um, Heat treating kind of alters or we kind of think of it as altering the properties of a rock out of the stone. Essentially, what's happening when you heat the stone, you're removing microscopic particles of water. And when that happens, any like little debris, dust type things we can kind of think about, particles, minerals that were attached with the water, get left behind in these pore spaces. So it fills it up. and then it makes that force go through a little bit smoother. And what we've actually determined with this is that when you are then flint knapping, you can then slow down your swing, which gives you greater accuracy when you're actually trying to flint knap. So this is really an awesome thing for when you're learning how to flint knap. Because if you don't have to strike as hard, if you don't have to swing as hard, you can learn how to be more accurate and start to see the places where you actually need to hit on the stone in order to move a piece. So that's a very condensed version of a much broader topic. So I don't know how much more we want to get into that.
Yeah, and I'll
I
just
could
point out
literally
that
talk for a while.
um, that it's a remarkable innovation that indigenous people and really people across the world, flint knapping, realized that they could heat treat certain rocks, but not all. So they knew exactly which rocks um, changed to make flint knapping better, but which types of rocks it absolutely didn't help with.
Yeah, some
And
rocks will start to degrade when they're heated, and some, depending on their size, will actually blow up.
yep. So John has a follow-up question before we get back to the first one. So does heat treating improve all cherts or do some types respond more?
So yeah, heat treatment does not work for all cherts. Like we were saying, some types of chert will degrade. The heat does not help very well. Um, and then that just really goes into some of the properties because I know that there's one out of like Michigan, and of course now I'm blanking on the name of that because now I'm on camera and live, and your brain goes ooh. But it absolutely just crumbles when it's heated. So, and like obsidian, you don't really need to heat treat obsidian. So
So this was our first question from Oliver Whitaker, and it's a really important question. I can also bring up a slide to help us answer this, but what should people do if they find an arrowhead?
oh boy. Well, it kind of depends on where you're finding it. So if you're on state or federal land, you should leave it. You could absolutely, take a GPS point, record where you're finding it, and then let us know. So that way, we can see, do we already know if there's a site on in that area? Or is this going to be a new site that we can fill out a site form? If it's on private property, well, you need to check with the landowner about what they would like to do. But again, even if it is on private property, we would love it if you would, find a, even if it's just a general idea of where it's at, share that information with us. We're not going to come out there and like dig it up and, take it away. We want to know where the sites are at. So that way, when we are doing research, we have a greater understanding of where the sites are and kind of what we're looking at. So
Yeah, those are really great points. So I just typed in the OSA general email into the comments box, osa@uiowa.edu. And yeah, the really important points are no collecting on public land. That includes city, county, state, and federal. But definitely bring along a GPS point. You can even map with your phone where you found something, take a picture.
mhm.
And it's kind of a misconception that people are going to lose their property or lose their artifact hunting spot if they tell us about it. That is absolutely not true. We don't want the objects. We don't have the space for them. We prefer the leave no trace when you're artifact collecting. So, take only pictures. But it's a really popular hobby. So of course, if you're on somebody's property, get their permission. Make sure you've got their permission. And if you are collecting, make a good map or take a GPS point about where you found that object. And you can email us the information that will go into our site database that helps us tell a really rich story about Iowa's archaeological past. So the more sites we know about, the more we can build that story. And we can also add that information to probably existing sites. But we don't give that information away. We're not going to tell anybody what you're finding or where you're finding. The Iowa site file is confidential, as John Dorshik is pointing out. And we do have this little do's and don'ts of artifact collecting. So Of course, get the landowner's permission. If you can, catalog your artifacts. That's really important too. Don't just take photos or make a map, but make a catalog that links the object that you found, maybe with the photos that you took of it, also with the GPS points. So you just have that record. Um, the more contextual information you get, the better, because that's part of the story. Send us that information, learn how to identify. So we've got lots of great guides to help you identify your objects as well. And a lot of people also bring their objects into the office for us to look at. Also, I recommend joining the Iowa Archaeological Society so you can attend more talks and programs about archaeology in Iowa. And you just have to go to this website there to do that. So don't see any more questions coming in. So I'm going to ask Veronica some of the ones that I've got set aside here. So yeah, you grew up in Iowa, but you left Oklahoma and you've sort of come back to Iowa in a different capacity as somebody directing field projects for the OSA. So what's like a typical day on your job that you can describe to people when you're out doing a field project?
Okay. Well, the great thing about my job is every day is different. So I get to spend some days in the lab, kind of, preparing to go out into the field. And then when I do go out into the field, um, it's anybody's ball game. So you can go out there and you could be doing pedestrian survey, you could be doing auger testing. Last week we were south of DeWitt in kind of a wetland area, and so we were getting to do a number of auger tests as well as pedestrian survey. Unfortunately, we were only finding a little bit of, 20th century glass or 21st century glass. Haven't quite determined that part yet, but um, that was, we would have preferred a little more rocks.
And just really quickly, can you explain to people why we do auger testing?
Sure. So depending, what phase level of survey and how, do you know if there's a site there or not? And so one of the things we're doing with auger testing is we're checking the types of soils that are out there, and we're basing that against already kind of classified maps, the soil maps that you typically find. No one has actually gone out to the ground and like tested that. So that's part of what we're doing. But then we're also checking to see if we have a buried soil underneath there. And that's actually the really critical thing. So a buried soil used to be the modern living surface. And so if you have a buried soil, that could be a very good indicator that you might have an archaeological site out there. And so it's usually pretty clear when you have that, because you'll start with, our current living surface, which is kind of a dark material, starts getting lighter, and then bam, you get this nice black, dark living surface again. And you're like, oh, well, that sticks out a little bit. And so if you find one of those, you have a higher probability of actually having an archaeological site out there.
Yeah. So basically, it's a way to sample
Yeah.
below the ground when we have an area that's going to be affected by future construction. And you can cover a lot more area that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a couple more questions coming in. Have you ever been stumped on identifying flakes made from cows treading on a stone in a pasture versus altered by humans? So
actually, that's a huge issue, is the difference between an artifact and an ecofact. And some of that, it really becomes a judgment call. And there are certain characteristics of flakes. And I believe, Elizabeth, that on one of the PowerPoints, we actually have some flaking characteristics.
oh yeah, I can bring that up. And I'm also just going to drop a quick link for a blog that we did. It doesn't cover, chert that's been smashed up by cow hoofs,
Right.
but there are lots of natural types of stones that look like they could be an amazing artifact because, as people say, it just fits in your hand so perfect or whatnot.
Exactly.
But yeah, there's a lot of things that are natural that are definitely cultural. And so I'm going to pull up a slide about flaking
Yeah,
characteristics.
and I'll try to
So
show a little bit. I don't know how well this is going to work, but on obsidian, usually it's kind of a little bit easier to tell. And usually, when you have an ecofact, you'll get a few of these characteristics, but you won't get all of them. And so, when we can get this up here, oh, perfect. We've got
yeah,
striking platform. You'll have a bulb of percussion. You'll usually have some aurelian scars, some ripple marks, and usually some type of termination. And usually, when you have an ecofact, you might have something like a bulb or percussion, but when you actually go to look at it, you can't actually find a striking platform. You know, it's just going to start looking super odd because you'll get the same thing with plows. When a plow goes through the field and it hits some of that glacial till, which again is some of the material that people would have been using to make their points, it can look very much like a flake until you actually start looking at it and start really dissecting all of these different areas. Um, but yeah, so sometimes it gets a little on the tricky side.
yeah, just the more training and ID, the better.
Yeah.
So we'll just go in order here. John's asking, what are your favorite point types and why?
Oh, my favorite point types. Well, of course, you know, Clovis and Folsom because they're the earliest. They're easy to distinguish. I've spent a lot of time working on them. They're very cool. I also have a favorite called a Calf Creek point. Unfortunately, I don't have an example here, but it is also very localized to kind of Oklahoma and Arkansas. But I love it because it's kind of big, kind of like a Snyder's point, but then it's very deep basal notching, like about an inch, inch and a half deep basal notching. And it's awesome because, you know, when you find one, you go, that's what that is. There's no question. I also have a love of it because there was a site I was working on, the Goodson Rock Shelter, and we were hoping that it was going to be a Clovis Age rock shelter, which would have been awesome because that would have brought up like the total number of Clovis Age rock shelters to like 3. But unfortunately, there ended up being a Calf Creek point attached to some rock fall that was in what we were hoping to be a Pleistocene age sand. But since it was in the sand underneath this rock fall, it meant that the rock shelter was not that old, but it was still really fun. And so I just have a great association then with Calf Creek points. So
Yeah. And I do have a quick or a slide that shows, I think most people know what Clovis points look like, but here's an example here. We have some of those fluted scars highlighted.
yeah.
So you can see that as well.
And then Clovis, the flute, it does not go up as far as on a Folsom. A Folsom, it's going to go at least about 3/4 of the point all the way up. So,
and we do find Clovis points all across Iowa. So here's another question that I might ask for a follow up because I'm not sure I know what this means, but maybe you do. So, what is your opinion on position sensitive art?
I'm not sure I understand what
Yeah,
that
I don't think I know what that means.
is. That
So,
like rock art?
I'm not sure, Matt. So, if you could type a follow up or an explanation in the comments to let us know what you mean by that. It's not a term that I've heard used as a professional archaeologist.
Me neither. I know I was very sad to hear that Painted Cave in Missouri was sold in a private auction, which was unfortunate because the Osage Nation is actually has a lot of history with that cave.
Yeah, for people who aren't familiar with that cave, do you want to explain really quickly where it's at? And
So that cave is in Missouri and it's on private land. It's been studied by professionals for the last couple decades, and they've been able to link some of the iconography, some of the images to various different tribes. And so one of them is the Osage Nation. And the landowners recently just sold it for like $2.2 million. So,
so, yes, there's a lot of us archaeologists
yeah,
hoping that there's continued protections for that cave.
yeah.
It's not easily accessible, so it is protected a bit by location. But if it could eventually change hands and go back to the Osage Nation, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
Still waiting for a follow up on what PSA means. So I'll just ask you some other questions that I have in my list. So you coming back to the OSA, you
Hmm.
get to travel all over the state
Oh, yeah.
doing these field projects.
I've seen more of the state of Iowa in the last 2 years than the previous 23 years combined.
And then, so with all of these new travels and the field work that you're doing, what are some of your new favorite places in Iowa that you've come to love and know through archaeology? So this could be, I mean, a place, a city, even a restaurant.
I really love the Yellow River State Forest. First of all, I didn't know Iowa had state forests, until I started, coming back and doing this job. And I really love it up there. It is in Alameda County, so it's in far northeast Iowa. It's absolutely gorgeous and stunning. I mean, the one downer is in 10 years of doing cultural resource management, it is the only place that I lose every single form of cell coverage. But that's all right. Um, and then in the complete opposite direction, I'm going to butcher the name, but the Wabaunsee State Park is also super beautiful, um, gorgeous location,
And
nice.
is that in the Lust Hills, if I remember correctly?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
it is. It is in the Lust Hills, so it is in the far southwest corner of the state.
Okay, so Matt is following up, and this is something we hear a lot from people who are trying to get to know what artifacts are, but basically, um, and especially a lot of natural objects look like there could be a face, or it could be an animal effigy, or there could be something carved in it. Um, that is by and large primarily not man-made, but we can, our brains make connections and
Mhm.
patterns. And so
Yeah.
things do look like faces or animals sometimes, but that doesn't mean that it's man-made. Do you have anything to expand on that?
Yeah, basically, pre-contact items, especially out of stone, like in Mesoamerica, you really get, they call them eccentrics, because it was knapped. So someone physically flint knapped a piece of stone to then look like a person or an animal. But there's no way that you would have to or use it as a tool. Usually with these things, anything that's going to be an effigy, it's going to be very, very clear that it is meant to represent something. Um, Unfortunately, and sometimes fortunately, our brains do make patterns. We start to see things in the stone. And we do get that a lot. And it's kind of heartbreaking, when people bring things in, they're like super excited. And you're like, it's a rock. Um,
Yeah,
so you just want to keep that in mind, definitely keep it, if you found it, in an appropriate manner. Because again, same, even a rock you would need to follow.
because they are cool. Our
Yeah.
brains do make those patterns and see things, and
And
that's
then you get great stories too, because then you remember that day and you had great memories of going out and finding this stone. Um,
yeah. But you're right. Typically, carvings and effigies are very obvious and
yeah,
intentional, and other things, yeah, our brains are just making those connections. They look like shapes and patterns, and other people are probably going to see those shapes and patterns as well. But and I'll just also say there's a lot of things that we don't
yeah,
know and recognize at times too.
absolutely.
So you are one of the younger field directors here at the Office of the State Archaeologist. And I didn't prepare you for this question. Oh, so Matt is following up, but um, so when you say it's super, super clear, you mean there are man-made marks and no question about it being made by human. Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, basically, and also, I mean, they weren't trying to be ambiguous about, what this is. Basically, you're going to look at it and go, "Oh, someone just made a bear out of clay." Someone, I wish Iowa doesn't really have the too many of these eccentrics, but you know, um, when you if you look up, Mesoamerican eccentrics on stone or stone, whatever, it's very clear that they took a piece of stone, they altered it into a shape. So you're still getting your knapping marks or whatever, your flake scars, flake removals, in order to create, this is a person, this is a face.
Yeah, in Iowa, more commonly, these effigies are going to be made out of clay. For example, pottery from the Glenwood culture in the Less Hills from about 1,000 years ago. There are a lot of animal effigies, Mill Creek pottery as well from Northwest Iowa. You can't always tell what the animal is, but animal effigies were really common as logs or handles on pottery. And also, lots of effigies or animals are carved out of catlinite.
Yeah.
So we have a question. This is from a geologist. So has anyone used ArcMap or other GIS to analyze sourcing of exotic versus local lithics on single site assemblages? I've always thought some interesting patterns would develop across Iowa. Um, and I do know before Veronica's time, so we do have other lithic specialists in the office and one who's retired who definitely is looking at local versus exotic. But do you know more about that?
So a little bit. I'm on the Iowa part is part of the issue, but I know people definitely have used GIS, especially as you're starting to look at distance models and distance decay models. I know that there is various people who have used ArcMap to at least record known outcroppings of different materials. Um, and it's a pretty common thing when you're doing a lithic analysis, especially if you're doing like, if you're an undergrad up at the anthropology department or even a master's student, even a PhD student, to look at, uh, local versus non-local materials. Um, I'm struggling right now to come up with one Iowa specific, but I know I've done one for Kansas as well as Oklahoma. So
Yeah, and we have a very extensive chert identification collection that is pinpointed to all of these different areas in Iowa
yeah,
where those source materials came from. And so we've
yeah,
got a catalog in the office that you can view the comparative collection, and researchers are welcome to come look at that. And there's also a version of that online on our website that needs further digitization, but you can look through. I'm just going to pull up the website quick.
yeah. And one of the nice things that we have is we have both a heated and a raw comparative sample. And then we have, known quarry locations. We're not the only place. There's uh, another researcher who in Iowa who has created an interactive map, and he's really focused on the eastern side of the state pretty heavily in locating different outcroppings of different types of chert.
And then, so Matt is following up. I was thinking of using a, ArcMap to try and ascertain areas of influence for a given culture in terms of trade versus personally sourced lithics. That definitely would be interesting to compare. And Matt, if you want to partner on that with some of our lithics people, definitely
Yeah,
reach out. And John Dorshik also piped in that Bill Whitaker did some similar work with the Edgewater Park site.
yeah, and I mean, Matt, definitely shoot me an email because again, some of the local versus non-local is going to depend a little bit on where's your site located, because and also your time period, because local versus non-local is going to change with the advent of the horse. So, how far can people travel in one day is usually what's considered local. Local is beyond that one day. Um, and so with a horse, you can obviously get further, but you can also collect more than what you can if you're on foot. Rock being ridiculously heavy. But
Yes.
so those are some of the kind of characteristics to kind of take into account. And GIS actually really helps also with topography because you also, people aren't walking in a nice flat straight line. We've got, the Southern Drift Plains, we've got the Less Hills, all of those elevational changes, everything like that will start to affect and influence how far someone can travel in a day.
Yeah, and I added Veronica's email to the comments, and Matt also follows up. I think it would be most interesting for areas of Iowa with zero local lithics. There definitely are those areas around, but we love collaborating.
Oh yeah. Well, and that's actually something that I did for my master's thesis. I absolutely looked at how people were moving across the landscape using an area where the bedrock was a sandstone versus two areas where it was limestone. Areas where you have sandstone, you're not actually going to have any chert native there. Chert comes out of limestone. So it was kind of a nice way to actually see where people were importing uh, chert from these various other localities.
And what region did your master's focus on?
So that was north, east, north central Oklahoma,
Cool.
and then it kind of came up into the corresponding areas in Kansas. So
Okay, so back to the question I didn't prep you about as one of our younger archaeologists in the office. What are some of the challenges you think that your generation and the next generation of archaeologists will face?
oh dear.
I know that's a tough one. I'm sorry I didn't prep you for that.
Yeah, I think some of it is just the changing, you know, political landscape as well as funding of how all this is changing, um, and also I would love to get into teaching a little bit, but that is certainly changing. There's a number of professors who are retiring, but because universities are under such financial crises, they're not filling those positions. Um, so then that's actually going to be impacting, the future generations because if they're not filling those positions, then, some of the baseline information isn't necessarily getting taught or it's going to have to come be taught in some different manner. Um, and I think, there's definitely going to be more emphasis on cultural resource management as long as, current political entities continue to understand the importance of, preserving the cultural heritage. And I think that that's one of those things that we really need to stress. One of the hopeful improvements is that, we now understand, that as archaeologists, we actually have a major issue with our inclusion. We like to think about, we're learning about other cultures, other people, but we don't often include them at the conversation. We need to bring in the Native American tribes. We need to bring in, the minority groups, the Hispanic groups, the African American groups, the Native American groups, and bring everyone to the table. And that's honestly, hopefully, how we'll get, a better story and a better understanding of what's going on. So, a couple of
Yeah,
negatives, one big positive. I mean, we know that we have this gap, and people are actively working forward, trying to, bring everyone together, bring everyone to the table. So,
yeah, and luckily, community-based participatory research is growing in
yeah,
archaeology. Iowa does a fairly good job of incorporating descendant voices early on in the conversations.
yeah,
But yeah, funding is always a big issue. But as long as preservation laws stay strong, hopefully we'll be okay. Um, and I don't see any more questions coming in, so I'm just going to ask another couple of quick questions. Um, so you spend a lot of time in the field.
I
As
do.
an archaeologist, what's your favorite field snack?
Ooh, favorite field snack. So, post field snack is going to be like gummy bears. Um, in
Just
the
get that
field,
sugar buzz to pep
yeah,
you up.
exactly. In the field, it's going to be boring. I'm going to go with trail mix, sadly, sans chocolate. Chocolate is really great in trail mix, but when you're in the field and it's 90 some degrees outside, chocolate's not the
It's
best.
gonna melt.
Yeah.
And then, what is something you wish people knew about archaeology that they typically don't?
Mm, wow. There's a lot on that one. As far as, especially when because we're talking about lithics quite a bit, um, that everyone, when they find a point or something, they really want to know, the typology. And I guess I'd really want them to know that that is just the beginning. The point type only gives us so much, but what it's made out of actually helps us to understand, as we were talking about with, Matt's comment about local versus non-local, you know, looking at the whole assemblage. So looking at the waste flakes that most people don't collect because they're not pretty, they're flakes. People like collecting the whole tools. But looking at that whole assemblage, looking at the raw material types, we can start to see movement across the landscape. We can start to see interactions. Um, we don't get this so much here, but like in Mesoamerica, especially with obsidian, we could see down the line trading with these, they call them bullet cores, because it starts big and it kind of gets small down, it's circular. And you can see how the communities would trade these cores once, okay, my community, we use them like this, we use them until they get to a certain size, and then we trade them with the communities going further. And then we can see how that raw material, how its use changes. Because when you're close to the source material and it doesn't take anything for you to go and get it, you're going to use it as a utilitarian, everyday type item. But when it costs you a whole bunch more to get that exotic material, you're not going to be using that for your everyday stuff. You're going to use that as your special stuff. That's going to be your, the nice china that you bring out on holidays kind of stuff. And so by knowing our different raw materials, we can start actually seeing some of that.
And Cherie, we say this all the time. It's not about the objects, but what the objects can tell us about people. And I like the comment that you made about the debotage or waste flakes. Most people don't collect them, and that's totally fine.
Mm-hmm.
They collect the diagnostic, the whole points, the broken points. But if you record your information and take that GPS point, that means an archaeologist or somebody else can go back and look at that whole assemblage to start to get that bigger picture, that story, and to build that picture, and even maybe do some spatial analysis in GIS, as Angela
Yeah.
Collin mentions. Um, so I'm not sure I quite understand this question, but were projectile points used during the same era as points made of rock? I have found points on the Nishnabotna, but no lithics yet.
So projectile points are a form of lithics. Lithics is a fancy way, a jargon way of saying a stone tool. Um,
Right. And there are often pieces of limestone or sandstone
yeah.
that maybe are shaped into a triangle that are not
Well,
actually projectile points.
except for
But
actually some were.
yep.
So that gets kind of tricky, especially when you talk about the limestone casings around the rocks, especially if it was, a harder material, a harder limestone, it could be shaped and used. Um, and you do get, so when, let's say we think about, the Bronze Age, the Copper Age, or even, contact period, and people are using metal arrowheads, you are still getting stone arrowheads as well. So just because people, start using metal, that doesn't mean rocks go away.
Right.
Metal is always been more expensive, so you still get your stone points as well.
Okay, so what are some of the names for smaller cultures that have been found in Iowa? For instance, in Ohio, there's one called the Fort Hill people who were Hopewellian. I guess I'll just point out that these cultural names are created by archaeologists, and they're not names that indigenous people have given themselves to refer. But some of the terminology we use in Iowa, uh, we, we have the woodland culture. Those were people who started using bow and arrow and pottery extensively, and then horticulture, and then farming. But we don't really have um, subcultures of woodland. I mean, there are some Adena influences and Hopewell influences that come into Western Iowa, but we really archaeologists name the smaller cultures for what we call the late prehistoric period, which starts about 1,000 years ago. So we have the Glenwood culture people from the Mills County, south of Council Bluffs area of the Luss Hills. And then we have the Mill Creek culture, which is northwest Iowa. Um, and then the Great Oasis culture and the Oneota cultures. And so those are the four main ones that we
Yeah.
have in
And I'd
Iowa.
really like to emphasize that those are modern names that archaeologists have come up with.
Yep.
So that's really kind of this crucial thing. And, we're linking those, we're creating that by, we see these similarities between material culture in an area and we go, oh, these people must be related. But we don't actually, necessarily know that. More than likely it is, but there can be some ambiguity, especially when you start getting a lot of different foci and everything like that.
A follow up from Alan was he was talking about bone points. So we definitely have bone points as well, but can we always date them?
No. Bone, you have a greater chance of being able to date since it is an organic material, but that can be super expensive. Um, those at least you can send off to testing services, whereas chert you can't. Um, the greater thing again, so this is going to come down to the assemblage. What is it in context with? Um, some bone tools can be a little bit more diagnostic-y than others.
Technical term.
Yeah, real technical term there. Um, but yeah, organic material, you have a greater chance of being able to date. But again, it's going to depend on, how big of a sample can you take and then send off to like Beta Analytic or some of the other, carbon testing places. And then, if it's too recent, if it's, a late pre-contact site, um, it's going to depend on
Yeah,
how
bone.
accurate those
They're
dates
much
are.
more challenging to
Yeah.
date. So we've got a two-part question from Matt.
Okay.
So it doesn't all show up on the screen, but in professional archaeology, does naming a new point type require a type site, or can a new point type be named with only a set of surface collected examples? Lots of times, amateurs end up with a significant number of points um, of a given style from a given area, and there hasn't been a type site excavated. So yeah, typology is
Ooh.
really, really tricky. And he says what he's referring to is a variant of hell gap that we see in about 20 counties of central and southeast Iowa that remains unnamed and, as far as I know, unstudied professionally.
I think um, it depends on what type of argument can you be made if you're doing a surface collection. I mean, a lot of, say, take Clovis. I mean, it took a long time before you actually had, a Clovis site excavated.
Right,
Um,
because for a type site, you need that undisturbed stratigraphy with an associated radiocarbon
right.
date.
Because that'll give you the dates. You can have kind of like an informal one with just surface. But again, it's going to depend on what type of argument can you make, about it being its own. And so, I mean, some of it is going to be, are you trying to make it a variant of Hell Gap? Or are you trying to make it completely separate from, Hell Gap in this example
And
that
I think that depends on the evidence you have. In archaeology, we always say there are lumpers and splitters. And
exactly.
with typology, sometimes there are so many variations or range in the measurements that it sometimes becomes impossible to assign a point type.
Yeah. And you also have to remember that people were reusing their tools. So one thing that we found, we've got a tool, a point, that was yay big and a point that was yay big, but they both seem very similar. Well, it's actually the same point style. It's just one started off bigger and then it was broken and reworked. and was made into a smaller and smaller point. Sometimes when your point is broken, you'll rework it into a new tool. It'll become a scraper, or it'll become a drill, or a knife.
Yeah, and he says much like Bajada and Rio Grande are Hell Gap variants.
Yeah,
Um, and this is maybe a controversial question, but how often do lithic specialists not agree on typologies?
often.
Often,
I
very,
mean, that's
very
just
often.
like anything else. You're always going to have disagreements, and especially with like the middle archaic points where they're starting to get small, they're starting to get corner notched. Um, and then we've got, 50 gazillion different naming types. And even then, you also have an issue of, um, especially with some of the earlier point styles, that there wasn't great communication between regions. So, like let's see, a what we call a Fresno point, so a small kind of triangular point, is also known as a Madison point. So it just kind of depends on which region are you. And there are people, I can guarantee you, that will argue with me that there are absolutely two different types, but they're small triangular points. I would
Yeah,
say that they're the same thing, but some people will argue the difference. So
yeah, and I'll just point out that we only know what we know as well, and so typology can only become stronger the more information we have, and so that's why it's important for people to send us pictures and report sites and let us know what they're finding and where, because then, yeah, we can start to strengthen our knowledge about typologies and variations and geographical range of these things.
yeah.
I'm not sure if you'll know this one, and I know there's lots of archaeologists watching who might pipe in, but have there been any woolly mammoth or mastodon kill sites discovered in Iowa? So I know that we have found um, faunal remains from mammoths and mastodons in every single county in Iowa.
Yeah, I can't think of any mammoth or mastodon kill sites. I can think of quite a few buffalo,
Hmm.
but I can't think of any mammoth or mastodon kill sites off the top of my head.
They're not coming to mind in Iowa, but I know, of course, I've definitely seen examples of. And was it the Folsom Point that was embedded in a mammoth
I
in
thought
in
it
the
was
Southwest?
a bison antiquus, but I could be wrong.
Bad archaeologist. I can't remember this right now. Yeah, so of course they've been found in other states. At the top of my head, I'm not sure if any.
I'm trying to even think of any like butchering, not necessarily even kill, but butchering or butchery marks. And
Yeah, we'll see if another archaeologist. Oh, so
yeah,
John Dorsick says not yet, but lots of closed points and mammoth teeth around. So we're still looking for that evidence. And then Matt also asked, what can you tell us about the buffalo kill sites? I'll just say we're going to hang on to this question for next week because Cherie Hari Arts, our archaeology educator and faunal animal bone specialist, is going to be doing a presentation on the butchering of a single bison
yeah.
skeleton from
I
Northwest
will,
Iowa. So she is our expert there, and she'll be
yeah.
talking about that next week.
I will just say that my like all-time favorite site of all is actually a mass buffalo drive site called Head Smashed in I think it's Saskatchewan, because sometimes you'll get individual bison butchery, but sometimes you'll get mass kills where they drove them into a corral, either a natural or man-made created one, or they would have drives where they would drive them off a cliff. And this is one where they would drive them off a cliff, and it's pretty ingenious. It's literally one of my favorite sites. If you haven't looked into it, uh, Head Smashed In.
Yeah, and then in Iowa, we do have the Cherokee sewer site
Yeah,
from Cherokee County here in Iowa. If you do a search on our Facebook post, you'll find several images from that site. It was excavated primarily in the 70s, but also the
yeah.
60s as well. So there's a lot of information on the Cherokee sewer site. But yes, Cherie is our bone expert, and she's going to be talking about butchering of a bison from PM7, which is in Plymouth County, and that's going to be next week, Wednesday. One more question. We'll just answer this last question. Were there any stone walls was the site you were talking about in Saskatchewan?
It might have been Saskatchewan. I'm somewhere up there in Canada. They had some rock piles. I don't recall. I don't believe that they're not waist high or anything, or at least not that I'm aware of. But they did have some rocks lined up to help drive and focus them into this area. Yeah. And then there's also some ethnographic records that they might have used, like woven, um, like walls out of reeds and stuff to help build some of that up.
Yeah. So we're gonna wrap this up now, but that was a lot of great questions, and I'm really happy that we had this opportunity for Veronica to do a Q&A so everyone can get to know her. And as we mentioned, she's one of our newer project archaeologists here at the Office of the State Archaeologist. And yes, we do love collaboration. So if you have questions or an idea for collaborating on research, just let us know. I'm gonna put in Veronica's email address one more time. Um, and we're getting some comments saying that Head Smashed In is in Alberta.
Okay, I knew it wasn't one
So
of them. It was going to be somewhere. I was thinking that in my head, and then I second guessed myself. I shouldn't
yeah,
have done
so that's Veronica's email address in the comments, and then I'm typing the OSA's general email address. Where if you have questions about recording sites, we would love to answer those questions. So you can get in touch with us anytime. So again, thank you for attending our Q&A. So we have two more lecture presentations, and then we'll do a Q&A with our state archaeologist, Don Dorshik, in October later in Iowa Archaeology Month. So thank you all for coming.